Hey, welcome back to another episode of Generative Genius, where we talk about real life examples of how marketers are using AI every single day. And I'm super excited today to have Sunil Subhedar join me and talk a little bit about his views on AI and what he's seeing in the marketplace overall. So, Sunil, welcome. Would love to hear a little bit about you for the audience.
Yeah, hey Stephen, great to be here. Yeah, a little bit about my background. For the last 20 years, I've been at the intersection of marketing and technology. I've had the privilege of being a founder and doing that great work, working at small startups to being at large enterprise companies. My stints at Uber and most recently Canva. And lately, I had a little bit of a taste of AI at Canva, and it kind of really piqued my interest. And so for the last year, I've been diving really deep into AI and in two different spaces. One is really helping other brands think about the strategy and adoption and implementation of AI into a marketing organization. And the second is I'm actually advising companies that are building AI products that are targeting marketing organizations and ICPs and helping them kind of bridge that gap of developing technology that's going to be impactful and useful for marketing organizations.
Very cool. So it sounds like you're the right person to talk to about the topic today. So I love that you've dived deeper. It's interesting. So, everybody has a little bit different experience when it comes to actually leveraging, utilizing, talking about, or actually taking part in AI. So I'm excited to jump in deep with you today and talk a little bit more. And maybe we can get into some nitty gritty details too in the way that you're thinking about it. Okay, well, let's just start out with a broad question that I always like to, just ask our guests. And as you're diving in deeper, learning about the capabilities that AI has, and as we take this idea of what AI is and how we use it, move it into the generative landscape as well, like where do you feel like from a marketing perspective, within the marketing landscape, there could be the most impact, right? Like what are you seeing with that right now?
Yeah, I think like there's been an evolution and kind of it's rapidly increasing. And so initially, AI, generative AI specifically, was a very prosumer engagement in terms of the use cases, really kind of one and done efforts. And what we're now starting to see is the sophistication of these large language models, as well as the integration and interoperability across tech stacks, is allowing for there to be a lot more enterprise solutions that a marketing organization can take. And I'll just give a few examples that I see that are really starting to kind of take effect. And I think about it from a standpoint of AI is really helping solve where there's a lot of time and energy and manual effort being put in. And it's creating a limitation or a bottleneck in terms of delivering output and impact. And so I think about it from a velocity and variance standpoint. And so from a content creation standpoint, there's opportunity to increase your content variance with generative AI. And we can talk about it from a brand perspective of upper funnel and kind of how it's being used. And we can talk about it from a performance perspective. But I think that it's really important to delineate, generative AI versus some of these more traditional AI and machine learning models that are still being used. And then also this new wave of agentic AI, which is helping to actually do the tasks. And so this interplay of these three are starting to become much more fluid. And those abilities are filling in the gaps that each one can't really solve.
Totally. And as you're starting to see the merger of those three come together, right? As we think about just the business ecosystem, companies large, companies small, companies that sit in between. And as we start to utilize all the technology too, like, do you see is there a greater advantage is it for all companies? Is there a certain area that certain companies see a greater advantage, at least at the beginning? Like what are you seeing in that way?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be an advantage. I think it's just about the exponential impact and step change impact that can happen. And the way that I'm kind of working with brands out there is kind of a crawl, walk, run mentality. To do really impactful things requires a heavy investment in resources and from a technical perspective, and also a data governance capability that is quite challenging to get to. It takes about a year to really achieve that type of level. But in the crawl space, in the crawl phase, I think the real opportunity is to start testing these third-party off-the-shelf solutions and starting to learn into the specific areas and tasks that are taking up a lot of the team's time. And so, when it comes to a lot of manual executional work, whether it is in creative production processes, whether it's in actual SEM keyword management, all these things and research, if we're talking about B2B, it's lead gen research, prospecting, All these things that could take a lot of time and energy can now be synthesized and used to create a way of collecting that information much quicker to then disseminate it and figure out how to craft it into whatever you need to do. So giving like specific examples in the brand and upper funnel side with generative AI, you now can create more concepts and storyboards faster because you can come up with an idea and create a brand concept. And so from even storyboarding to actual visual small pieces of video content, you can start to create something that is actually going to represent a final output, right? Variance opportunity creates an opportunity to really create a plethora of different scenarios. Whereas before, you really only had one or two maybe concepts that you were using and hoping that one of them would work. And so that variability really helps on the brand side. Like on the performance and conversion side, that volume and variance is now being able to be achieved by having so many different versions of content to test and play. And particularly algorithms like Meta and Google really need that information to be fed to figure out how to optimize performance. And the more variance there is, the higher the performance output.
Totally. And I mean, I love that you jump right into content being a major space, right? Like within the marketing organization that this can ultimately help. And you talk about like different variations. We talk about A/B testing a lot, right? But I think what I'm hearing from you is that there's no more, when you think about leveraging AI the right way with content, there's no more A/B testing. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G testing that we really should be thinking about in the marketing landscape, and then letting the platforms that we know can deliver success for us, especially amidst, by the way, like talk about social, Meta, you're watching like changes happen with businesses overnight on the effectiveness of that. So how do you feed the beast with Meta? What I'm hearing you say is that's with variation. That's with lots of different concepts. That's with identifying which concepts are going to be best for your brand by putting as many of those concepts into place as possible. And AI is enabling us to do that in as fast a way as possible. So speed to market. You also talk though, right, which is really, really important. So, you also talk about like making it easier on the actual brand marketers, right? When it comes to workload and things like that. Like what are some ways that you've seen the creative impact when it comes to workload in the marketplace as well?
Yeah, I think like there's different aspects from an inspirational standpoint, from a concepting standpoint. The thing that I hear the most that is happening is the specialty skill sets that sit in particular types of creative organizations where some individual could only do it can now be conceptualized by someone who does not have that skill set. So a great example is like, I'm not a video editor, but I could create a video concept using some of these tools. And so it creates a faster translation. And even for performance marketers, what we're seeing is examples of, hey, I need to create a brief. And usually I would just show them my old creative and see how it works. But I can actually use my old creative and create new concepts and variants based on that. And I can share that with my creative team or with an agency to give them more direction. So then the time to actually translate a brief into something that's actionable, and for someone who is not in that world of verse of looking at it from their lens, they're looking out from a video, which is they're more familiar with, they can now take that content and make it, polish it up to make it that final product. And so, yeah, that speed to market's increasing, the amount of FTE hours to do that work is increasing, and then the type of skills that you need in terms of your team is you don't need to have as many people doing all these different roles because you can now start to consolidate some of those particular skill sets into one individual and really have one specialist really doing the final output.
Totally. And as we, it's interesting, right? The world seems to weave in between generalists and specialists, right? As back and forth as we get more and more innovation. I think one of the interesting things that I see around all of that is that the ability to identify the right types of success metrics, right, that go about it with specialization versus more generalist approach can certainly change and be different. If I'm, you talk about taking this on, brands taking this on, crawl, walk, run approach. If I'm in this crawl phase, what are you thinking about from like just an OKR or a KPI perspective? Like what are the things that should be important to me as a brand to think about tracking early on? And obviously that sophistication can increase over time.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think about it from three different pillars: is people, process, and technology. From a people perspective, it's really an organizational shift, and particularly as marketing leader, you have to create space and time for your team to have opportunity to learn these products in a safe and compliant manner. And so, something that we did at Canva, which was really great, is there was both technical and non-technical training courses to get access to these tools and very clear guardrails on how and where we could use them, but that really created that space. I've seen companies like Instacart that are creating OKRs around AI usage and AI outputs. And so if your whole company is really investing that time and your organization is set up to succeed by giving that opportunity, then you're going to be much more successful. The second is really around process. And that is really thinking about how do you actually get AI implemented and see outcomes? And how are you going to measure the effectiveness of your implementation? And so it always starts with, like any sort of, I'm a performance marketer, but I think about it from a hypothesis and like a goal standpoint and milestones. Like, what are the milestones that we hope to achieve? What is our hypothesis in terms of the improvements, whether it's an internal efficiency, productivity, or it's a campaign improvement performance that we would hope to see? And have we set up a test framework to validate the way that we're using AI as an implementation to show the differential of when using AI versus not using AI? And so if you start with the foundation and have it at the beginning, then you know your path of effectiveness. What I would say that is challenging is that the timeline for these is much, much longer. And
Yeah.
so I really work with leadership to do, which is not a marketing, it's not as common in marketing, is to really decouple this type of work to be more of an R&D and exploration and saying, hey, this is going to be a 6-month horizon for us to see it. I'll keep you up to date on what we're progressing, but it is a test and learn and iterate process. And so we focus on creating milestones that we can share, but outcomes and impact really happen much, much later. And I think that's the challenge that I've seen with a lot of marketing organizations is how do you get that type of runway when it's a much longer thing? But in the end, that outcome and step change of impact will be significant.
The runway is interesting because we've also talked a lot about failing and failing fast, right? You hear about all of this too. Yet I feel like what you're saying is that has to be the fail fast is still part of the mentality, but that's not if you fail the first time or the second time on what you're trying to do. Like that's not the end. Don't stop. Continue to try to innovate in this longer term philosophy because at some point you're going to find an unlock that's going to be key for your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And these AI, generative AI is a black box. I am constantly testing and seeing where it's kind of breaking its at its seams in different products and tools that I use. And it's only when you actually test it, pressure test it, that you learn where it's doing it and how to modify it, or how to take from one AI, generative AI tool, or and take one piece of thing where it does it really well and put it into another AI tool that will do that second leg and the second piece of that work. And so it is that interplay and interoperability that's going to be really critical. And if you don't have both the time to experiment and to learn into those things, or have a way of thinking through that from a framework and perspective, it becomes really hard to see success.
Totally. Well, interesting. You talk a little bit about, or actually, you talked a lot about content and the importance of leveraging AI in your content philosophy, strategy, storyboarding, things like that. Is that the place that you see generative AI being the most disruptive at this point? Or are there other areas within the marketing ecosystem that are either ripe for, or you're starting to see some true change when it comes to leveraging this technology?
Yeah, from a generative AI perspective, it is a visual and content. It's copy and visuals. It started with text, came to images, and now it's evolving to video. And that's really just like compute processing power that it takes to build a sophistication. And so as costs come down for the compute, and as the sophistication and capability of these models are evolving, you're seeing more use cases and capabilities appear. But yeah, I mean, I really just want to be very thoughtful around how you think about generative AI, because authenticity and originality is also still pretty important as a foundation. And so it's really figuring out where it's going to help to create a repetitive task that doesn't have a strategic framework of requirements around it. It's like, hey, I'm going to do these set of tasks, and I want to have these set of concepts created the individual that's running these types of things still has to be involved quite heavily. And so I think that that's the important piece that I really want to say is like, yeah, content creation and volume is really great, but I've seen studies that show that SEO AI content performs terribly right now. It's not performing better than the other content out there because it's just not yet there. That might change. But what has changed and what it, from an SEO perspective is changing is the way that you're searching for content and how the search engines are putting AI results at the top. So you have to rethink your strategies around content creation and what you're doing as AI becomes much more the higher result and response that you get.
Totally. And I mean, a lot of great examples here today that you've mentioned, and I appreciate them. I know a lot of folks that tune in, they just want to figure out, like, how do I stay ahead of this curve, right? This is something that is just constantly changing, constantly, iterating and optimizing and whatever word and coin phrase, you'd like to throw in there around how fast generative AI is making an impact. What have you done personally just to like stay up to speed on that and make sure that you're on the right side of that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a framework that I use, like the 70-25-5 rule. And so 70% of my week is focused on exploration and learning. I get that through newsletters. I get that through talking to people in the industry and reading content. 25% of my time is actually going deeper into specific types of tools, which I think have potential, and learning about them, learning about the demos, learning about the team behind them and their capabilities, the longevity. And then 5% is actually playing with those tools and really pressure testing them. And that's the only way I've really seen. There's so many companies out there that are creating AI or saying that they're AI. And there's honestly a lot of snake oil, a lot of wrappers of LLM models that really don't have any competitive advantage or can build a competitive moat. And that we've seen that as these LLMs evolve, you're seeing that these companies are kind of going to the wayside. And so proprietary data is really critical in terms of its ability to actually deliver something unique. And then from an executional standpoint, it's understanding the ICPs and what they need. And particularly, I see the challenge is that most AI companies come from a technical background and are designing for technical UX experiences. And so marketers who are not technologists and more generalists are failing to be able to use these products. And so when I go into roundtables, they're like, AI doesn't work. And I was like, it's not that it doesn't work. There's a little bit of user error, but it's also these products are not designed in a way to actually help that. And so that's one of the things that I've actually been working with a lot of companies is like, you really have to reframe how these tools and UX experiences look like to help marketers use them, because a lot of this is a lot technical and back-end stuff. So just like we saw in the world of HTML coding and where, all the stuff was on the back end, and now you have all these WYSIWYGs that allow for these drag and drops, Canva being one of them, that is the differential that you're seeing, and that AI will change when you can speak to something and you can do stuff in a way that feels much more natural than someone who's technical and is used to coding in the back.
Totally. You talk about naturalness. You talked earlier about authenticity too. I think one of the unique things, and you also talked about the way that brands think about what their overall policies on leveraging AI looks like. This to me brings up kind of like this ethical alignment of what I'm utilizing in order to better my brand, but also maintain that authenticity, right? There's this interweb of like almost conflicting or inner conflict that happens across the board. How have you been thinking about and helping your clients to navigate?
Yeah, I think it depends on the company. There are a lot of companies that have really strong brand control and high sensitivity from a privacy and compliance perspective of usage of AI. And there's higher risk when you have a higher target on your back for fees and copyright infringement use cases. And so large companies really are struggling to get that approval from their privacy and policy teams to use this. And in other cases, I've seen companies that are all in on AI and are really diving in deep and have created the right framework of compliance and guardrails and are using it in ways that create less risk, right? And I think, Canva is a really great example. Is like you learn quickly by doing it internally and using it internally that when you start to build commercial facing products, you've really done that rigor. And so, Canva's AI journey started 5-6 years ago. And most of the companies that you see where their AI is actually working, they started that a while ago. So they have a little bit of those rounds of learning. But like even Canva needs to have a PR crisis team to understand when things don't go right because it is a black box. And so that preparation, that understanding, you're seeing Adobe having to kind of backtrack and come back, Figma having to backtrack and come back, because the preparedness of knowing how to use AI and how it will act and behave was not really yet there. And so that balance of who's going to be impacted by AI really has to be thoughtful and considered in terms of how AI is going to be used and utilized. And then there's also a more philosophical question is like, well, if you're creating content that is not human generated, is that actually your ownership? Do you actually own that content? And if the source of that content and models came from someone else and it's being aggregated, is there some credit or compensation that they should be receiving for that? And so I think it's going to be, what I say is that AI data is going to become the new PII. We saw this with CBCAA and all these GDPR, where data became a very, very difficult thing to do from email perspective, mobile device ID perspective. This is going to be the same way we're going to see with AI data. And that's why your internal proprietary data is going to become so much more powerful and valuable. And your communication to your users of how you're using it, what you're doing with it's going to be really important so that you don't get into these types of situations.
What are your thoughts on just that last part, right? The idea that the consumer or the user ultimately requires some level of transparency as to what's being done, right? How their data is being used. Like, you think there should be a compensation portion of it? Does there need to be a conversation just that people just need to simply give a right to it? Like, what are your thoughts on just the transparent nature or the transparency brands should have when speaking to whatever generative AI tactics they're taking when it comes to their advertising, their content creation, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would put it in two buckets. I would say, like, when it comes to actually the creation of something, that there was a source of information that it was pulled from, that I think is where there should be some sort of compensation or approval of licensing of that content, because it is sourced. And then again, it's figuring out how to do that. I think that's going to be like a blockchain thing, and it's going to have to be very complicated because it kind of is like the way of the Spotify and how the music industry, kind of was created. I think it'll be a very similar type of thing. On the other side, if you're doing using internal data, companies have been doing this for a long time. I think the question becomes of how it's being used to create value and more enhanced experiences because of the access of that data. And that I think is really important from the transparency communication standpoint, that we were doing, lifecycle marketing at Canva, we really focused on figuring out, like, how do we create value for you? And the more information that you can give from a qualified perspective of who you are, what you're interested in, the more relevant my content can be so that I'm not just spamming your inbox. And so it's that relationship and partnership to say, yeah, I'm going to be using your data, but my hope is that I give you better experiences. And that, like, the Netflix is a great example. Like, I'm okay giving them all my data because I at least spend less time trying to find content.
You spend less time trying to find content on Netflix? Sunil, that's no way. What do you mean? We all sit there and just scroll next. I mean, the number of anyway, I digress. Continue.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, again, all the stuff that we've seen from the data world and email world, those same situations are going to be playing out. I think it's much more challenging because of the way that there's not a predictability in how language models actually output. And there's still so much of a learning to know around hallucinations and all these other things that are happening. And so it's just going to be a harder problem to solve. But I think that just like there is an IAB, there needs to be some sort of council around copyright and usage for AI purposes that are marketing, explicitly recognizing and indicating in your post that this was created in an AI way. But if you do it to show something that's cool and exciting, like there are companies like Coca-Cola and Starbucks that are showing that they're using AI to create stuff. And I think it's exciting. So it's just a transparency thing. And again, as long as you're communicating what you're doing and the experiences and outcomes are feeling magical and relevant, then I don't think that there'll be as much of an issue.
Totally. Well, dude, this has been super fun. I appreciate you answering all the questions that have come at you, like fastballs or maybe more like softballs. I don't know how you felt about it, but any last parting words, thoughts, ideas, just in the landscape overall, as we've got a group of people out there listening, watching, trying to think about how can I just do this more effectively for my.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I tell people is like have a natural curiosity to learn and learn and test and play with it. I think that there is a hesitancy and concern in terms of affecting people's jobs and other things. And the way I think about it is like this is another tool, and the people who know how to use this tool are going to be able to get ahead and be able to be successful. And there's going to be a transformation in terms of how organizations look. I say marketers are now technologists. You have to be a bit more technical in the nature of how you think and how you are actually approaching your tool and the tactics and efforts that you use. And so the more that you can do exploration, like I'll tell you from this year, for this year, I've probably, improved my efficiency of AI to give me back 10 to 15 hours of time. And I think that's huge in terms of what I could do. I did a project for a company, a client that would normally take me a month in a week. And so it is those types of implementations through constant testing, through constant iteration and learning that have allowed me to do those things, both in my personal and professional life. The opportunity to continue to learn and to play with these tools is exciting. I was fortunate to be at Google when the mobile ecosystem blew up, and I just saw this shift and change in terms of how people were engaging and communicating and consuming content. This is the next wave. This is what's happening. And to be at the front of it and to understand it, even if you have 5 or 10% more than the next person, it's going to be a huge advantage.
Totally. Awesome. Well, dude, I really appreciate you joining today and talking through. This has been super fun. Generative Genius putting it together and having a lot of really great guests come in and have an impactful conversation. I wanted to say and thank you personally because you really got into some specific details, some specific examples of how folks are thinking about it, utilizing it, leveraging generative AI across the board. So thanks for getting into that overall. And it's really great having you today.
Yeah, it was wonderful to be here. Thanks, Stephen.
All right. Take care, Sunil.
Bye.